Why some women have higher sex drives than others. Just take a second. Let the absolute weight of that question really sink in. It feels super simple at first glance, right? Almost like something you just say in passing. But beneath that surface, there is a highly structured proposition that your brain is actively decoding in milliseconds. Okay, let's dive into this, because we are going to tear this sentence apart, literally piece by piece, to see exactly how it works its magic and opens the door to some incredibly complex human dynamics. So let's start by isolating the very first subject established here, some women. Immediately, the premise establishes a very specific subset. It completely avoids a universal absolute. Notice, the author doesn't say all women. They don't say most women. This phrasing instantly builds a boundary. It tells your brain right out of the gate that we are dealing with a distinct category of people, and honestly, that pushes back against centuries of historical generalizations about female desire. It demands that you acknowledge a division and individual differences before you even know what that division is actually about. Now, think about that word, some, for a second. It is delightfully ambiguous. I mean, by definition, some refers to an unspecified number or part of a whole. It introduces an inherent lack of quantification. It leaves the exact scale of this group in utter and complete mystery. Like, are we talking about 5% of the population? Are we talking about 49%? The text flat out refuses to give us the data. Instead, it forces us to ask, well, who are these women? Are they the women who found a profound sense of emotional safety that suddenly unlocks this drive? Are they individuals whose relational intimacy has completely shifted their personal baseline? It's just a brilliant way to make the premise feel incredibly significant while making us imagine all the deeply personal factors at play. Now, what's really interesting about this is the core variable it introduces next, higher sex drives. This is the engine of the entire phrase right here. This is the exact attribute that separates our unspecified group from the rest of the world. We've moved from identifying who we're talking about to exactly what defines them. The text introduces this concept of an elevated drive, an increased capacity, a magnified baseline. But what exactly fuels that engine? Is it purely physiological and hormonal? Or, as modern psychology is increasingly pointing out, is it deeply tied to the emotional safety, the trust, and the profound intimacy established with a partner? And that word higher forces a really fascinating question. Higher than what? If you say something is higher, it can't just exist in a vacuum. It demands a reference point. So I want you to ponder what the word higher actually implies here. Are we talking about some clinical biological norm mapped out in a medical journal somewhere? Or is it highly personal? Actually, scratch that. It's more likely an elevated desire that's directly sparked by a massive surge in emotional connection. A woman's drive might be higher, not just compared to a statistical average, but higher because her current relationship provides a level of deep intimacy she's literally never experienced before. The source text doesn't explicitly tell us, so it relies entirely on our own assumptions of what's fueling that fire. Which brings us to the final piece of the phrase, than others. This is how the text inherently creates its comparative dynamic. It finally gives a name to the foil. You see, the premise could have just stopped at higher sex drives, leaving the comparison completely implicit. But by adding then others, it actively forces us to recognize the existence of the rest of the population. And in the real world, this comparison often plays out right inside relationships themselves. You'll have one partner whose profound need for deep intimacy drastically alters their desire, compared to others who might prioritize entirely different things. There's a really distinct tension established here. It's like a linguistic scale, weighing some women on one side against others on the exact opposite side. The text creates an automatic dichotomy between a specific subset and the remaining population. You literally cannot have the some without the others. But think about the real-life tension this actually represents for a second. The dichotomy between those whose desire is intensely fueled by intimacy and those walking around with entirely different baselines, that creates incredibly complex relational dynamics every single day. The text masterfully divides our attention and forces us to look at both sides of this human equation. So the crucial point is that this tiny 9-word text is a perfectly constructed framework that outlines a hugely complex social reality. Let's recap. First, it identifies a distinct group using the word some. Second, it applies a comparative variable to them with the word higher. And third, it establishes a baseline population to measure them against with the word others. In just a handful of words, the author has built an entire architecture. But they haven't just built a linguistic world. They've perfectly framed the intricate, often completely misunderstood landscape of female sexuality and personal desire. But you know what? We've purposefully ignored one word until right now. Let's strip away all the comparative language, all the subjects, all the variables, and isolate the single most powerful, commanding word in the entire source text, the very first word, why. This one single word changes the entire nature of the text. Without it, the phrase is just a passive observation. But by slapping why at the very front, it becomes a catalyst. It demands we look way beyond the surface and investigate the root causes. Like, for instance, the incredibly powerful, undeniable link between deep emotional intimacy and physical desire.
And this brilliantly illustrates how the text functions entirely as a prompt for inquiry rather than giving us any facts. Step 1, establish the comparison. We just spent all this time exploring how intricately it builds that divide. But step 2 is where the real hook lies. It leaves the cause entirely unknown. The text doesn't tell us that this phenomenon happens, it assumes we already agree it happens, and immediately demands that we figure out the underlying cause. Leaving the cause a mystery is exactly what forces science, psychology, and honestly each of us individually to explore how shifting levels of intimacy actually shape human sexuality.
Why some women have higher sex drives than others. Hopefully bringing the full text back and allowing that complete thought to resonate with you now than when we first started. We've broken down all its linguistic components. We see the hidden dichotomy, we see the forced comparison, but more importantly, we've uncovered the complex human realities hiding right behind these 9 words. We see how what looks like a simple categorization totally transforms into a demanding investigation of what makes us tick, how we connect, and how intimacy literally physically changes us. The text laid out all the parameters for us. It showed us the who, the what, and the who else. But the only thing that truly matters, the one thing that keeps us engaged and endlessly searching, is the missing piece, the foundational cause of that drive. And so I'm going to leave you with this single, ultimate question hanging right here. Because understanding the why, especially understanding how our profound need for emotional connection and intimacy ultimately drives our physical desires, well, that helps us understand ourselves a whole lot better. Why?